The world had become unrecognizable. Cities once bustling with life now lay in ruins, overtaken by the dead. Humanity's greatest achievement, civilization itself, had been brought to its knees by the very creatures it feared. The undead, once thought to be a myth, were now a nightmare come to life. As governments fell and military forces crumbled, the remnants of humankind had no choice but to band together for one last attempt to stave off extinction. The final war against the undead was about to begin. In the heart of what used to be a thriving metropolis, a ragtag group of survivors made their stand. Among them was Captain Jake Mason, a battle-hardened soldier who had seen too many friends fall to the relentless wave of undead. He had lost his family in the early days of the outbreak, and now, the only thing keeping him going was his determination to survive, not just for himself, but for the future of humanity. With a grim expression, he surveyed the ruined city, knowing that the battle ahead would be their most dangerous yet. The group, small but fierce, had managed to establish a temporary stronghold in the basement of a fortified building. The air was thick with tension as each member of the group prepared for what was to come. They had no illusions about the challenge they faced. The undead were no longer just mindless monsters, they had evolved. Faster, stronger, and more cunning than ever before, they were a terrifying force to be reckoned with. Among the survivors was Dr. Amelia Hayes, a brilliant scientist who had spent the past year studying the undead in an attempt to find a weakness. She was their best hope for survival, but even she knew that the odds were slim. Her research had led to some promising findings, but the truth was, no one knew exactly what they were up against anymore. The undead seemed to be adapting, and no one understood why. Her eyes were focused, scanning the data on the old tablet she held in her hands. The screens flickered from time to time, but the information they contained was vital. "We need to move fast," Amelia said, her voice steady but strained. "The longer we stay in one place, the more likely we are to be overrun. We need to hit the heart of the undead horde, their central location, and destroy it. It's the only way we can stop them from spreading further." Captain Mason nodded grimly, his mind already calculating their next steps. The plan Amelia suggested was risky, but it was the only chance they had left. He turned to his team, a group of survivors who had been through hell and back together. Some were former soldiers, others were civilians who had learned to fight just to stay alive. But all of them were united by one common goal: survival. "Get ready," he said, his voice low and commanding. "We're going to take the fight to them. We're going to show the undead that we're not going down without a fight." There was a moment of silence, and then the sound of weapons being checked and gear being prepared filled the room. Each person knew what was at stake. If they failed, it would not only mean their deaths, but the extinction of humanity. No pressure, right? In the shadows of the ruined city, the undead stirred. Their senses were keen, and they had begun to evolve in terrifying ways. The first sign of their evolution had come months ago, when survivors began reporting that certain undead no longer shuffled mindlessly. They ran, screamed, and even used tools. The undead were learning, adapting, and soon, they would be impossible to escape. They were organized, and they were getting smarter. Captain Mason's mind raced. They had no way of knowing how many of the undead had gathered at the central location Amelia had identified, but they knew it was a risk they had to take. The location wasn't far, but the route would take them through some of the most dangerous areas in the city. The undead were everywhere, lurking in every corner, waiting to strike. "We'll move out in 2 hours," Mason announced. "We have to be fast and silent. We can't afford any mistakes." Amelia glanced up from her tablet, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "There's one more thing," she said softly. "I've been analyzing the virus that caused the outbreak. There's something strange about it. It's almost as if it's not just a virus, it's a parasite, controlling the infected. If we can destroy the parasite, we can stop the undead." Mason's gaze hardened. "What's the catch?" "It's not simple," Amelia admitted. "The parasite is integrated into the brainstem of the infected. To destroy it, we need to get closer than we've ever been before. It's a suicide mission." The group fell silent at her words. They all knew what that meant, the risk was greater than ever before. But they also knew that there was no turning back. The undead were evolving, and humanity's final chance for survival rested on their shoulders. The clock was ticking. The fate of humanity hung in the balance. Would they survive, or would they be the last generation to walk the earth? As Captain Mason looked out over the devastated city, he knew that the war for humanity's survival had only just begun. The morning light barely filtered through the dust-covered windows, casting eerie shadows across the survivors' makeshift camp. The stillness in the air was unsettling, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Captain Jake Mason stood at the entrance, staring out at the broken cityscape. It was a city he had once known, but now it was nothing more than a graveyard, a twisted reflection of what it had once been. The undead roamed its streets like predators hunting their prey, a constant reminder of how far humanity had fallen. "Are we ready?" Mason asked, his voice gruff. He turned back to face the group, his eyes scanning each of them in turn. Amelia Hayes stood near the back, adjusting the strap of her pack. The look on her face was grim. She had shared her theory about the parasite controlling the infected, but even she wasn't sure how much of it was true. The research was still incomplete, but time was running out. The group couldn't afford to wait any longer. The mission ahead was risky, but it was their only hope. "We're as ready as we'll ever be," Amelia replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "The information I've gathered should be enough to give us a fighting chance, but we won't know until we get there." Mason nodded. "We move out in 15 minutes. Everyone check their gear. No mistakes." The group, a mix of military veterans, civilians, and scientists, went through their routines with practiced efficiency. Weapons were checked, ammunition counted, and supplies redistributed. They all knew the stakes. Failure meant certain death. They would have to cross the dead city, avoid the horde, and make their way to the heart of the undead infestation. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would cut through the central district, which had once been a vibrant part of the city. Now, it was a no-man's land, overrun with the undead. If they made it to the central building, a high-rise that had once housed government officials, they would be able to destroy the parasite, if Amelia's theory was correct. But that was a big if. The plan had a deadly flaw. The central district wasn't just crawling with undead, it was a stronghold for them. Over the past few months, survivors had reported strange activity in the area. The undead didn't just wander aimlessly, they had been gathering in numbers, as if drawn to a single location. It was as if they were being controlled by something that went beyond mere instinct. "I'll lead the way," Mason said, his voice steady but firm. "We'll move quickly, stay quiet, and follow my lead. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. If we get surrounded, we fight our way out, but only if we have no other choice." His words echoed through the group, and there was a collective nod of agreement. There was no room for hesitation. The dead didn't wait for you to make up your mind, they attacked with savage precision. The group filed out of the building and into the streets, their footsteps muffled by the debris underfoot. The city was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of a nearby zombie or the soft shuffle of their feet. Mason's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, constantly on the lookout for any sign of movement. Every corner, every shadow, could conceal a threat. As they moved deeper into the city, the air grew thick with tension. The survivors stuck to the shadows, using whatever cover they could find to remain out of sight. The undead were relentless, but they were also predictable. They followed a set pattern, and as long as the group kept their distance and avoided making noise, they would have a chance. But the closer they got to the central district, the more uneasy they became. The streets were growing more cluttered, and the number of undead increased. It was as though they were drawing closer to a point of no return. Mason's heart raced as they neared the heart of the city. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. The undead weren't just waiting, they were gathering. "There," Mason whispered, pointing ahead. "That's our target, the central building." The high-rise loomed in the distance, a decaying monument to the city's former grandeur. Once, it had been a symbol of power and wealth. Now, it was a fortress for the dead. The group approached cautiously, sticking to the alleyways and using the cover of abandoned cars and debris. As they neared the entrance of the building, they froze. The sound of moaning and shuffling echoed from within. The undead were inside, waiting. The scent of decay hung heavily in the air, making it hard to breathe. But it wasn't just the smell that sent a chill down Mason's spine. It was the sense that they weren't alone. They were being watched. "They know we're here," Amelia whispered. Her voice was tense, her eyes darting around nervously. "The undead, they're evolving. It's like they're aware of us." Mason's grip on his rifle tightened. He had heard rumors of intelligent undead, but this was the first time he had felt it firsthand. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the group slowly advanced toward the entrance. Every sense was heightened, every movement cautious. Just as they reached the door, a loud crash echoed through the building. The undead had sensed their presence, and they were coming. Mason didn't hesitate. "Go! Move!" he shouted, slamming his shoulder into the door, forcing it open. The group flooded inside, weapons drawn, ready for the fight of their lives. But as they entered, something even more horrifying awaited them. The undead weren't just random creatures. They were organized, and they had been waiting for them. The final war for humanity's survival had begun, and it was going to be more brutal than any of them had ever imagined. The central building was more than just a hideout for the undead. As Captain Mason and his team flooded into the dark, decaying structure, the overwhelming stench of rot filled their lungs. The building's once polished marble floors were now cracked and stained with the remnants of humanity's failed attempts to resist the inevitable. They had entered a nightmare, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred. Mason motioned for everyone to take cover behind the large pillars that lined the entrance. His mind raced. The undead had known they were coming. How? The group had been careful, and yet somehow, the horde had been prepared. His grip on his rifle tightened as he scanned the vast atrium. He could see the shadows of moving figures, just barely visible in the dim light. "Stay low. We move fast," Mason whispered. His voice was steady, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a mission to eliminate a horde, it was a battle against something more intelligent, more dangerous. The group had crossed into the heart of the undead's territory, and now, they would have to fight for their very survival. Amelia, her eyes wide with fear and determination, leaned close to Mason. "We need to find the control center, the room where it all started. That's where the parasite's main hive is. It's the only way we can stop this." Mason nodded. "Then we get to the control room, destroy the parasite, and get out. No distractions. We move as one." With the plan set, the team began to move through the building. The eerie silence that had once settled over them now felt like a suffocating presence. Every step they took seemed to echo in the emptiness, and Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He wasn't sure if it was just the tension or if something more sinister was at play. The hallways were narrow, the walls covered in grime and decay. The flickering of the overhead lights did little to alleviate the feeling that something was lurking in the darkness. As they moved deeper into the building, they encountered no undead. At least, not in the open. But the absence of visible threats only made Mason more cautious. The undead were cunning, and the quiet was often their most dangerous weapon. They reached an elevator shaft at the end of the hallway. The building's infrastructure had been ravaged, but the elevator shaft was still intact. Mason checked the shaft, assessing their options. The control room was on the top floor, a heavily fortified area that had once been used by city officials for meetings. It was a strategic location, and they would have to be quick to avoid detection. "I'll go first," Mason said, signaling to the others to stay back. "We'll rappel up and breach from the top." The group prepared their climbing gear, and Mason, followed by his team, began the slow ascent. The elevator shaft creaked ominously with every movement. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the silence between each ascent was deafening. It felt as though time itself had stopped. As they reached the top floor, Mason motioned for the team to stop. The door to the control room was just ahead. But something wasn't right. The building, once eerily quiet, now felt alive with the presence of something more dangerous than just the undead. There was an unsettling stillness in the air. No moans, no shuffles, no groans. Only silence. "I don't like this," Amelia muttered under her breath. Mason nodded grimly. "Stay close. Be ready for anything." With a swift movement, he kicked open the door to the control room. Inside, the scene was like something out of a nightmare. The room was filled with computers and monitors, but the monitors weren't displaying typical information. Instead, they were showing live feeds of the undead in various parts of the city. But what caught Mason's eye was the central screen. There, in the middle, was a massive, pulsing mass, a parasite, far larger than anything he had anticipated. It was the source of the infection, and it was alive, feeding, and growing stronger with every passing second. It's evolving," Amelia whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "It's not just a parasite. It's a colony." Before Mason could respond, the lights in the room flickered, and the door slammed shut behind them. The survivors spun around, weapons drawn, as the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. A cold chill swept through the space, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness beyond the control room. "Trap!" Mason shouted. "Get to cover!" The room seemed to come alive as the lights flickered again. This time, shadows began to emerge from the corners, not the slow, lumbering zombies they had encountered before, but something different. These creatures were faster, stronger, and more intelligent. Their eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light. These were not just infected, they were soldiers in the parasite's army, and they were here to protect their queen. The survivors opened fire, their weapons blasting in rapid succession. The mutated zombies moved with an unsettling precision, dodging the gunfire and closing in on the group with terrifying speed. Mason fired a shot at the nearest one, but it only slowed for a second before charging at him with inhuman strength. He barely managed to sidestep it, but the creature's claws raked across his arm, tearing through the fabric of his jacket and leaving a gash that burned with an unnatural heat. "Fall back," Mason ordered, his voice urgent. The group retreated toward the control room's back exit, firing as they went. But no matter how many of the mutated undead they gunned down, more seemed to pour out of the shadows, faster than they could keep up. Amelia's eyes were fixed on the parasite mass in the center of the room. "We need to destroy it," she screamed. Mason nodded. "Get to the core. I'll hold them off." The battle had begun, and it was more brutal than they ever could have imagined. The undead weren't just mindless creatures anymore. They were warriors, and they were ready to wage war on humanity. The battle was chaos, every moment a blur of gunfire, screams, and the relentless surge of the undead. Captain Mason fought with everything he had, each movement calculated, each shot aimed with precision. But no matter how many of the creatures he took down, more seemed to flood in from the shadows, faster, stronger, and with an eerie sense of purpose. It was clear now, these weren't the mindless zombies they had been facing for months. These were soldiers controlled by something far more sinister. Amelia had rushed toward the heart of the room, her eyes fixed on the massive parasite pulsing in the center. It was the source of the outbreak, the reason for everything that had gone wrong. If they had any chance of survival, they had to destroy it. But with every step she took toward the core, the mutated undead grew more aggressive, closing in on her position. She could hear the sounds of the group behind her, fighting to hold back the tide of monsters, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. There was no time to waste. "We can't hold them off for much longer," shouted Sergeant Darrell Brooks, one of the former military men in the group. He fired a burst of rounds into a group of the mutated undead that had been charging toward them, but the creatures kept coming. "We don't have a choice," Mason yelled back, his voice strained. He shot another of the undead, but it barely slowed as it lunged at him, narrowly missing his throat. He ducked, then quickly raised his weapon to finish it off. His movements were growing more desperate. Time was running out. Amelia reached the control panel that was positioned near the parasite mass, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the heat radiating from it, a sickening warmth that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. The mass was alive, its tendrils moving as if searching for something, reaching out with an almost sentient awareness. It was no longer just a parasite, it was a living, breathing organism, a hive, and its purpose was clear. It was evolving, adapting, and it would stop at nothing to see humanity wiped from the face of the earth. Amelia. Mason's voice broke through her thoughts, urgent. We need to go. Now. She turned toward him, but her mind was racing. The control panel in front of her flickered, showing streams of data that meant nothing to her. But there was one thing she could decipher. A button, a red button, glowing ominously. She knew instinctively what it was for. It's the detonator, Amelia muttered to herself. I can initiate a self-destruct sequence. It'll take the building down, and hopefully, the parasite with it. Mason's eyes widened in horror. Amelia, don't. But before she could respond, a horrifying screech tore through the air. The mutated zombies had regrouped, and they were charging at full force, their glowing eyes fixed on the survivors. There was no more time for debate. Amelia slammed her hand onto the red button. The room was instantly flooded with an eerie, pulsating light. We have to get out of here, she screamed. The sound of the self-destruct sequence starting reverberated through the entire building. The walls trembled as if the structure itself was waking up, shaking off the infestation that had overtaken it. There was no turning back now. The parasite would be destroyed, but at a cost. Mason turned and sprinted toward the back exit, his team falling into line behind him. The mutated undead were closing in, but they were too far away. They had a chance, if they could make it to the emergency stairwell before the building collapsed. The air was thick with dust as the walls continued to tremble, signaling the beginning of the end. Move! Move! Mason shouted, pushing the team forward. As they rounded a corner, a massive explosion erupted behind them. The force of it threw them all off their feet, but Mason quickly regained his footing and pulled Amelia up. The explosion was only the first wave. The building was coming down, and they needed to get out, fast. The stairwell was only a few hundred meters away, but it might as well have been miles. The building was disintegrating around them. The walls buckled, and debris rained down from above. The screams of the undead could be heard as they were consumed by the collapsing structure, their once insatiable hunger silenced in an instant. But there was no time to savor the victory. They had to survive the collapse, and the clock was ticking. Keep moving! Brooks yelled, firing his weapon behind them to hold off any zombies that were too close. Don't stop! Mason led the way, his team following closely behind. The stairwell door was just ahead, but as they neared it, the ground beneath them shook violently. The building was starting to split. Dust choked their lungs as the ceiling above them cracked, sending chunks of concrete raining down. Go, go, go! Mason shouted, urgency in his voice as he reached the door and kicked it open. One by one, the survivors scrambled into the stairwell, Mason bringing up the rear. The door slammed shut just as another explosion rocked the building, sending a shockwave through the stairs. The survivors were in the heart of the crumbling structure, but they still had one obstacle to overcome, the undead. As they descended, a group of mutated zombies appeared at the bottom of the stairwell, blocking their exit. Mason's heart sank. They were trapped. We can't hold them off. Amelia shouted, panic rising in her voice. We're not going to make it. But Mason wouldn't accept that. Not after everything they had fought for. Not after all they had sacrificed. There had to be a way out. Hold your ground. Mason ordered, taking a deep breath. He adjusted his grip on his weapon, prepared to make the ultimate stand if necessary. The walls around them trembled as the self-destruct continued its countdown, and with every second, the building came closer to its inevitable end. But in this moment, with the undead closing in and death looming over them, the team made one final decision: survival was the only option. The stairwell echoed with the sounds of shuffling feet and the guttural growls of the undead. Mason's team was trapped, the heavy, crumbling walls threatening to cave in at any moment. The emergency exit was just a few floors below, but the mutated zombies had them cornered. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the dust swirling around them only made it harder to see and breathe. Time was running out. "We can't hold them off much longer," Brooks said, his voice low but laced with urgency. His weapon was smoking from the relentless barrage, but the undead just kept coming. They didn't tire. They didn't hesitate. They were everywhere. Mason's mind raced. He had no clear plan. No clear escape route. His military training had always emphasized strategy, but here, in the heart of the apocalypse, every plan seemed useless. The only thing that mattered now was survival. "Amelia," Mason said, his voice sharp. "You've got any ideas left? The self-destruct countdown's at what? 3 minutes?" Amelia's hands trembled as she checked the timer on the small device in her hand. It was flickering erratically, a malfunction from the chaos. But the countdown was unmistakable. 2 minutes, she answered, her voice tight. "And those things are right on top of us." "Damn it," Mason muttered, his gaze flicking between the rapidly advancing zombies and the crumbling exit door at the end of the stairwell. "If we stay here, we're all dead. If we go forward, the undead will trap us. But if we can make it outside, maybe we have a chance." "But the building's coming down," Brooks shouted, frustration lacing his words. "The collapse is only going to get worse." Mason clenched his fists. The weight of the situation was crushing him, but there was no room for doubt. He had one choice, and it was dangerous. "We'll have to take the risk," he said. "We fight our way through, make it to the rooftop. If the building falls, we use the emergency ropes to rappel down." Amelia frowned, clearly unsure. "But the zombies?" "We don't have a choice," Mason snapped, cutting her off. "We make it to the roof. Now." The team scrambled to follow his lead, fighting through the waves of mutated zombies that surged from the shadows, their unnatural strength pushing the survivors back with each step. The undead were closing in faster than Mason had anticipated, but he wasn't about to give up. "Stay close," Mason barked. "And don't stop firing." They moved forward, weapons raised, each survivor covering the others as they fought their way through the darkened stairwell. With each passing moment, the roar of the collapsing building grew louder, a constant reminder that time was running out. The zombies were relentless, but Mason's team had the edge in experience and skill. Brooks cleared a path with precise shots, while Mason and Amelia pushed forward. The others followed closely behind, their movements synchronized, their goal clear, survival at any cost. As they neared the rooftop access, the walls shook violently. A massive explosion from below sent tremors through the building, and a part of the stairwell collapsed in a cloud of dust. The survivors coughed and stumbled, their eyes stinging from the debris. "We've got to go, now!" Mason shouted, urging everyone forward. But as they reached the rooftop door, they were met with an unexpected horror. A massive horde of mutated undead had already reached the rooftop, their glowing eyes fixed on the survivors. They had no way of escaping now. "Get down!" Mason shouted, grabbing Amelia and pulling her behind a large concrete pillar. The zombies were closing in. The team had no cover left, no escape route. The rooftop was their final stand. Amelia's face was pale, and her hands shook as she raised her rifle. "We can't fight them all off," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "We need a distraction. We need something to keep them away long enough to get to the ropes." Mason's mind raced. The ropes were on the other side of the rooftop, but the zombies were blocking their way. He could hear the rapid beat of his heart, each second dragging on like an eternity. Then, the answer hit him: the building was rigged with explosives, a contingency in case the city fell into chaos. The self-destruct system wasn't just in the lower levels, there were charges all over the building. "We have to trigger the explosion," Mason said, a dangerous spark of hope igniting in his chest. "If we detonate the explosives near the zombie horde, it'll give us just enough time to get to the ropes. But that'll destroy the whole building." Brooks protested. Mason nodded grimly. "The whole damn building's coming down anyway. We either take our chances with the explosives or we die here." We don't have a choice. Without waiting for a response, Mason grabbed a handful of grenades from his pack and handed them to Brooks and Amelia. We throw them down there and create enough of a distraction to get to the ropes. We're not leaving without a fight. Amelia hesitated, glancing at the advancing zombies. It's insane. But it's the only shot we have. Mason turned to his team. On my mark, we throw. We'll run right after. Ready? The team nodded, adrenaline flooding their veins. With no other option left, they took their positions, ready to throw the grenades and make their move. Now! Mason shouted. The grenades sailed through the air, exploding in a series of deafening booms that shook the rooftop. The mutated zombies were thrown into disarray, their bodies disintegrating in the blast. The survivors wasted no time, rushing toward the emergency ropes on the opposite side. But just as they reached the edge, an explosion rocked the building from below. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a part of the rooftop began to crumble. Time was running out. They had seconds to act. Mason grabbed Amelia's hand and urged her toward the ropes. Come on. We're almost there. As the team began to rappel down the side of the building, the explosion detonated with a final, earth-shattering roar. The building shook violently, the collapse just moments away. The survivors didn't look back. Their lives depended on what came next. The descent down the side of the building was a blur. The ropes burned in Mason's hands as he rappelled, every moment a race against time. The explosive aftermath of the detonation had sent a shockwave through the entire structure, and the building groaned in protest, a dying beast. The survivors were far from safe, but they had no choice but to keep moving. As they neared the ground, the sounds of the crumbling city surrounded them, the shattering of glass, the cracking of steel, the distant growls of the undead. The horde wasn't just confined to the building now, it had spread throughout the city, a living nightmare consuming everything in its path. Mason's feet finally touched the ground, followed by Amelia, Brooks, and the others. The moment their feet made contact with the debris-laden street, the city seemed to swallow them whole. They had made it out, but the world around them had turned into a battleground. The city had fallen. We need to move, Mason said, his voice grim but steady. The streets are crawling with them. Amelia surveyed the destruction around them. The buildings were smoking ruins, fires breaking out in every corner, and the air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and decay. The world that had once been a bustling metropolis was now a ghost town, a tomb for humanity. We'll head for the outskirts, Brooks suggested, his eyes scanning the horizon. There's a military safe zone there. At least, there was. If we can get to the supply depot, we might find something useful. Agreed, Mason said. But we move fast. The longer we stay out here, the more chances we give the undead to find us. With their course set, the team began to navigate the maze of wreckage, sticking to the alleys and side streets, trying to avoid the open spaces where the zombies were most concentrated. The atmosphere was tense, each of them on edge, waiting for the inevitable encounter. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the distant groans and crashes of the undead. We don't know how much longer we have before the military pulls out, Brooks added as they moved through the wreckage. They'll be focusing on keeping the rest of the city from falling, but it's a matter of time before they abandon the perimeter. We need to get to them before that happens. Amelia, who had been silent for a while, turned to Mason. Do you think there's anyone else out there? Survivors, I mean. Or are we the last ones? Mason hesitated. He wanted to believe that humanity had the resilience to survive, but everything about this apocalypse had shattered that optimism. I don't know. I haven't seen any signs of survivors since the building collapsed. We just have to focus on getting ourselves out of this. The group continued to move cautiously, staying in the shadows. As they passed the remnants of what used to be a residential area, Mason couldn't help but glance at the shattered windows, the empty streets that had once been full of life. It was hard to fathom how quickly everything had changed. The peaceful lives of countless families had been replaced by this nightmare. Suddenly, a distant scream broke the silence. It was unmistakable. Someone was still alive. "Did you hear that?" Brooks asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "Yeah," Mason replied, his instincts kicking in. "We need to check it out. It could be a trap, but if there's a chance of rescuing someone, we can't ignore it." They moved in the direction of the scream, their footsteps light but quick. The sound grew louder, coming from an alley not far ahead. The closer they got, the more Mason's heart pounded. It wasn't just the scream that unsettled him, it was the desperation in the voice. Whoever was out there was in serious trouble. They turned the corner into the alley and found a young woman, no older than 20, backed into a corner by a group of zombies. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and she was clutching a small knife in her shaking hand. The zombies were closing in, their eyes glowing with hunger. Without thinking, Mason raised his rifle and took aim. A single shot rang out, and the first of the zombies collapsed, its head exploding in a spray of gore. The others turned toward the noise, but they were too slow. Brooks and Mason quickly took out the remaining zombies, their weapons working in perfect coordination. Within moments, the threat was neutralized, and the alley fell silent once more. The young woman was panting, her body trembling with fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. "I didn't know how much longer I could keep them away." Mason lowered his rifle and took a cautious step toward her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. She nodded but looked down at the knife in her hand, her eyes filled with sorrow. I'm alone. Everyone I knew, they're gone. I thought I was the last one left." Mason's expression hardened. It wasn't easy to admit, but the reality was clear. "You're not the last one. But the world we knew, it's over." Amelia stepped forward, offering a bottle of water from her pack. "You don't have to be alone anymore. We're heading to the military safe zone. We can help you get there." The woman looked at the group with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You really think we can make it there? The city's overrun. They'll be everywhere." "We can make it," Mason said, his voice firm. "It's the only chance we have left." With the new survivor in tow, the team continued their trek through the ruined city. But with every step they took, the odds of survival seemed slimmer. The undead were everywhere, and the world was collapsing around them. Yet Mason couldn't afford to lose hope. Not yet. As long as they had breath in their lungs, they had a chance to fight back. The journey ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear, survival wasn't just about fighting the undead. It was about holding on to humanity in a world that had lost it. The journey to the military safe zone was brutal, each step more taxing than the last. The group had managed to avoid the larger horde, but the streets were no less dangerous. Every alley seemed to hold hidden dangers, and every corner could be the last. The undead were relentless, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. But the survivors weren't the only danger lurking in the ruins of the city. Mason led the group through a narrow street lined with dilapidated buildings. They moved quickly, but cautiously, knowing that the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. Their new companion, the young woman, had joined them without hesitation, but there was something about her that didn't sit right with Mason. She had been quiet since they rescued her, her eyes always scanning their surroundings, never truly settling on any one person for too long. Amelia, who had been walking beside Mason, leaned in. "You've noticed it too, haven't you? She's acting strange." Mason nodded subtly, keeping his eyes on their path. "I don't know what it is, but something's off. I'm not sure if it's just the stress of everything, or if she's hiding something." Brooks, who was bringing up the rear, shot a glance over his shoulder. "It's hard to trust anyone these days, especially after everything we've been through. But we can't afford to leave her behind. Not with the way things are out here." "I know," Mason said, his voice low. "But we can't afford to be blindsided, either. Not now. Not with so much at stake." They continued on in tense silence, the weight of the situation hanging over them. The military safe zone was just a few miles away, but every mile felt like a lifetime. The streets grew more desolate as they neared the outskirts of the city. Signs of life had long since disappeared, replaced by the haunting remnants of a civilization that had collapsed. As they rounded a corner, a loud crash echoed through the alleyway. Mason instinctively dropped to a crouch, his team following suit. The sound had come from an abandoned warehouse on the left. "Stay quiet," Mason whispered, signaling for the group to move slowly toward the source of the noise. They crept closer, their weapons at the ready. Another crash followed by a low growl. Something, or someone, was inside. Amelia motioned for Mason to take the lead. With a deep breath, he nodded and approached the door of the warehouse. The hinges creaked as he carefully pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of decay was thick in the air, a mix of old food and the unmistakable stench of the undead. Mason gestured for the group to follow as they moved into the warehouse, their eyes adjusting to the darkness. They moved cautiously, aware that danger could be lurking in every corner. The low growls grew louder as they ventured deeper into the building. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. It was faint, but it was there. Mason spun around, his heart racing. His eyes locked on their new companion, the young woman, who had slipped quietly behind them. She was holding a handgun now, the barrel aimed directly at Mason. "Don't move," she said, her voice cold and distant. "I didn't want it to come to this, but you're all too trusting. I've been playing you this whole time." Mason's mind raced. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice laced with disbelief. She smirked, a cruel, hollow expression. "You think I'm just some scared survivor? I've been watching you all from the moment you picked me up. You have something I need. You've got supplies. You've got a way out. But you're too soft to survive in this world. And that makes you a liability." Brooke's eyes widened in shock. "You were using us the entire time?" The woman nodded, her finger tightening on the trigger. "It wasn't personal. But this world isn't about friendship or loyalty. It's about survival. And now, I'm going to make sure I survive." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "So, what? You plan to kill us all? Take our supplies and leave us to die?" The woman's eyes flickered, but there was no remorse in her gaze. "That's the plan." Mason kept his cool, despite the surge of anger building in his chest. He knew they needed to act fast. He couldn't let her pull the trigger, not when they were so close to safety. But the woman had caught them off guard, and it wasn't just the gun that made her dangerous. It was the desperation in her eyes, the madness that had taken root deep inside her. "You're making a mistake," Mason said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to do this. We can still make it to the safe zone. We can help each other." The woman's expression faltered for a moment, a brief flicker of doubt crossing her face. But then it was gone, replaced by cold resolve. "No. You're weak. You're all weak." In that split second of hesitation, Mason made his move. He lunged forward, knocking the woman's arm aside just as she pulled the trigger. The bullet missed, embedding itself in the wall behind them. The impact sent her off balance, and Mason took advantage of the moment, slamming her to the ground. "Don't!" Brooke shouted, but Mason had already disarmed her and pinned her down. The woman struggled beneath him, but Mason's strength and desperation gave him the upper hand. "Enough," Mason growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not going to kill us. Not today." Amelia stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You could have had a future with us. But you chose betrayal. Now, you get nothing." The woman's eyes burned with hatred, but she didn't resist. She knew it was over. She had lost. Mason stood up and motioned to the others. "Let's go. We don't have time to waste on this. The safe zone's still out there, and it's our only chance." They left the woman behind, her angry cries echoing through the dark warehouse. The group knew that trust was a fragile thing in this new world, and one betrayal could cost them everything. As they stepped back into the chaos of the city, Mason couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could survive. Betrayal wasn't just something they'd face from the undead. It was something they'd have to keep an eye out for in the living, too. Survival had become a game of survival of the fittest, and trust had no place in it. The sun had set, and the cold night air swept through the broken streets, carrying with it the eerie sounds of the city's ongoing collapse. The once bustling metropolis, now a decaying ruin, seemed to exhale a deep, hollow breath. Mason and his group trudged onward, exhaustion weighing heavily on their shoulders, but their resolve was as solid as ever. They had been through hell, betrayal, loss, the constant threat of the undead, and yet, they were still alive. Barely. The safe zone they sought, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a distant dream. The journey had taken longer than expected, and the city was quickly becoming a death trap. The further they moved, the more dangerous the streets became. The horde was everywhere, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Mason glanced back at his group, his eyes scanning for any signs of weakness. Brooks, who had been the steady rock of the team, now showed signs of weariness, his steps slower than before. Amelia's sharp eyes never left their surroundings, her fingers constantly twitching toward her weapon. The new survivor, a woman named Sarah, had fallen into line, but Mason could sense the tension in the air. It was hard to trust anyone after the betrayal they'd faced, even if she had been useful. Her silence spoke volumes. "How much farther?" Brooks asked, breaking the silence. He wiped his forehead, sweat mingling with the dust of the ruined city. "We're close," Mason said, his voice grim but resolute. "Just a few more blocks, then we'll be at the outskirts. We'll be in the clear soon." Amelia's eyes narrowed as she scanned the street ahead. "We'll be in the clear if we can avoid getting swarmed. But I don't like the look of this place. It's too quiet." Mason shared her concern. It had been quiet for too long. The kind of quiet that only preceded disaster. They'd passed through several residential areas where the undead had been thinned out, but the eerie stillness now felt like a trap. Something didn't sit right. "Stay sharp," Mason ordered. "Keep moving. We're almost there." As they pushed forward, they reached an old gas station that had once served as a gathering point for survivors. The flickering lights from the gas station's broken neon sign cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. It looked abandoned, but Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They approached cautiously, each step bringing them closer to what could either be their salvation or their final resting place. Brooks moved ahead, his rifle raised, eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Amelia was close behind, scanning the rooftops for any signs of movement. Sarah stayed toward the back, her hand tight around her knife, her eyes constantly flicking between the others, her face betraying no emotion. Mason stopped just short of the gas station's entrance and looked around. Everything appeared still, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something was wrong. "Take positions," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to make sure we're not walking into a trap." They fanned out, each member of the group taking cover behind the wreckage of nearby vehicles and broken concrete. The tension was palpable. Seconds felt like hours as they waited in the shadows. It was then that they heard it, a low growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet. A group of zombies appeared from the shadows, emerging from the buildings on the opposite side of the gas station. The horde wasn't large, maybe 5 or 6, but they were enough to put the group in danger if they didn't act quickly. "Take them down," Mason ordered, raising his rifle. He fired first, a clean shot to the head of the closest zombie. The creature dropped instantly, its body crumpling to the ground. Amelia followed, her handgun taking out another undead with a swift shot. Brooks took out the third with a burst from his assault rifle. The zombies fell quickly, but the noise was enough to attract more. From the alleyways, more began to emerge. The quiet had been broken, and the undead were on them in full force. The group fired rapidly, picking off the advancing zombies one by one, but they were being overwhelmed. The noise from the gunshots was drawing more attention, and Mason knew they couldn't keep fighting forever. "Fall back to the station," Mason yelled. "We need to fortify." The group rushed for cover, moving toward the entrance of the gas station. They slammed the door behind them, and Mason quickly bolted it shut. Their breaths were heavy, the adrenaline pumping through their veins as they backed away from the windows. "We're trapped," Brooks muttered, his voice tinged with fear. "Not yet," Mason replied, his mind working quickly. "We hold out here until we can find another way out. The military might still be near, and they'll have a plan for this." But Mason knew the reality of their situation. The military might have abandoned the city long ago. They were alone now, in a world overrun by the undead. As they gathered their supplies and prepared for the worst, Sarah spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "What if we don't make it?" Mason turned to face her, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Then we fight until the end. That's all we can do now." They knew it was the last stand. The walls of the gas station were thin, and the undead were closing in. The air was thick with tension as Mason and the others prepared to defend their position. There was no more running. No more hiding. It was survival or extinction. Mason glanced at his group, the people who had become his family in the chaos. They had survived everything the world had thrown at them so far. Now, it was time to face their final test. And whatever happened next, they would go down fighting. End of Part 8, the final chapter.